Is this on? Okay. Hi, and first of all, thank you to Connor, wherever he is, there you are, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming tonight. I know it's a beautiful night out, so it'd be a good night for a walk on the beach or something, so I appreciate you taking the time out to come. And let me share with you the fruit of my labor for the last few years. As was introduced, my topic for my dissertation is called Crossing the Threshold of Faith, the Problem of the Conversion of the Baptized according to Pope John Paul II. And I wanted to just to bring you along with me a little bit, first of all, in terms of how this became an important topic to me. Kind of a personal story that's wrapped up in it. And then I'll just to give you the context and the motivations of my inquiry, and then to share with you where my studies led me, and what I think I learned, and what I hope will be fruitful for the church in some way. So first of all, this study rose out of a series of personal experiences that I had growing up. I was, like most of you, baptized as a child and as an infant, and raised Catholic. My parents took me to Mass. I had religious education once a week. We didn't have a Catholic school in my town, so in spite of that, I learned my prayers at my mother's knees, like most of you, and we went about things in the normal course of Catholic growing up. But I also developed a fairly ingrained habit of lying and stealing, and then lying about what I stole when I went to confession. And this had become kind of a pattern with me growing up. In the early 1980s, there was a tabloid newspaper that carried a story about how the world was going to end in the early 80s sometime, and I made up my mind that I was going to be as rotten as I could until the year before that happened, and then I would join a convent and everything would be okay. That was my strategy as a teenager. So, but I had the good fortune in high school of making a close friend who, in the context of a sleepover one night when we were talking about all the things that girls talk about when they're teenagers, and I was complaining about a variety of things, and she listened for a long time, and then at some point she said, "Carol, have you ever prayed about this?" And my immediate reaction in my heart was, why would I do that? What does that have to do with anything? And in the course of our conversation, I became aware that my friend's attitude towards her life and her faith were quite different from my attitude towards my life and my faith. She was not Catholic, but I was struck by the fact that I had never heard anybody ever talk about God the way she did. As if he cared about her, as if he took interest in her concerns, as if he was on her side. Her witness to me sparked something. It got wheels turning for me. And under her influence, I began to read the scriptures, and I began to converse with God in a new way. I began to experience what it meant to have a relationship with him. And then, as I was being prepared for confirmation, I heard a well-reasoned apologetic, a scriptural apologetic for the Catholic faith. I came to understand what a sacrament was, what the Eucharist is, and where the Church gets her teaching authority. And it was a proposal that made sense to me then, as it makes sense to me now. So, fast forward 6 or 7 years from that fateful night, I found myself working in parish youth ministry, and one part of my job was to represent my parish in the planning of a diocesan youth conference. And among other things on the proposed schedule for this diocesan youth conference, I found that we had several speakers coming in. We had icebreakers, we had the skits, the mass, the workshop on sexuality, the workshop on social justice. But there was nothing in the program about a personal relationship with God. And so I threw out the possibility on the conference room table. I said, would we ever do like a little workshop on how to have a personal relationship with God? And the diocesan youth director looked at me and said, "Oh yeah, we don't believe in that. That's a Protestant idea. We're the people of God. It's Jesus and we, not Jesus and me." And I thought, gosh, I must be doing something wrong, because here I am having a personal relationship with God. I mean, nobody else around the table disagreed with him, and so I just thought to myself, there must be something wrong with the way I'm looking at this. I don't understand how you can be the people of God unless you have a bunch of people who are people of God, people who belong to God. So anyway, one day I arrived at my parish where I worked, and I found the news that several boxes of books were about to be thrown away. And so I toddled down the stairs to see if there was anything to be rescued. And among the books that I rescued from the bin that day was a little book called Catechesi Tradendae by Pope John Paul II, which at that time had never been opened. It's now held together by a rubber band because it's been thumbed so many times. And in the summer of 1981, I found this book laying on my desk, hadn't been read before, and I started thumbing through it. And I found in Catechesi section 5 that the definitive aim of catechesis is to put people not only in touch with, but in communion, in intimacy with Jesus Christ. Only He can lead us to the love of the Father in the Spirit and make us share in the life of the Holy Spirit. And I found that this Pope was singing my song. I found out the Pope agreed with me. He didn't agree with the diocesan youth director. He went on to say in Catechesi Tradendae number 19, he's continuing to talk about catechesis because that's what this document is all about. And he said, in catechetical practice, well, first of all, he talked about this initial conversion-bringing proclamation of the gospel. And he went on to say that in catechetical practice, this model order must allow for the fact that the initial evangelization has often not taken place. A number of children baptized in infancy come for catechesis in the parish without receiving any other initiation into the faith and still without any explicit personal attachment to Jesus Christ. And all of this began to just resonate with me. The Pope is saying something here about the fact that people are supposed to have an explicit personal attachment to Jesus Christ. They're supposed to have intimacy with Jesus Christ. That sounded like a personal relationship with Jesus to me. Anyway, that was kind of step one, and I put this back on the shelf, and I thought, well, that's really a nice thing that he wrote. And it didn't really go much further than that for me. But over the next several years of my life, I began to listen more closely to Pope John Paul II, and I noticed that this theme was everywhere in his writing. Personal relationship with Christ and conversion are major, major themes. And it's been my experience that many Catholics are uncomfortable with this idea. I've often been accused of sounding like a Protestant when I talk about this. To some, it seems to be somehow anti-ecclesial, because if everyone has a direct line to God, what do you need the church for? In my own experience, having a personal relationship with God has made the sacraments come to life. It has made Scripture come to life. It has made the ambiguities that are left in Scripture make me need the authority, the teaching authority of the church. Okay? It doesn't separate you from the church. It makes you alive within the church. And it's become my passion in life to expose this train of thought for the church. So that's what I'm about in this thesis. So what I tried to do in my thesis was to try to trace the personal, theological, and philosophical development of the thought of Karl Wojtyła, and to examine how the mature fruit of his thought in each of these areas became conjoined in his treatment of the topic of conversion during his pontificate. My study tracks the development of Karl Wojtyła's approach to experience through the examination of several of his major pre-papal writings, those being his first dissertation on St. John of the Cross, his second dissertation on Max Scheler, the philosophical anthropology that's articulated in The Acting Person, and another book called Sources of Renewal, which is his handbook for the implementation of the Second Vatican Council. There's also two articles that are important. One is an article called Thomistic Personalism, and a second called The Personal Structure of Self-Determination, which forms the core concept of his philosophical anthropology. First of all, just to give you a bit of an overview, Karl Wojtyła had kind of three major intellectual epiphanies along the way that form the backdrop to what became what I'm calling his Phenomenology of Christian Conversion. The first one was a discovery of St. John of the Cross, the Carmelite. The second was his discovery of St. Thomas's metaphysics, and I'll tell you a little bit about each of these as we go along. The third was his discovery of phenomenology through his dissertation on Max Scheler. And then all of that kind of percolated into a new description of what he called an adequate anthropology. He felt after reading John of the Cross and trying to get a hold of St. John of the Cross's description of the experience of faith, which was elaborated on a scholastic framework, he felt that the Thomistic approach was inadequate. He felt that there was something lacking in the philosophy of St. Thomas in terms of the description of the inner experience of the human person, that there was more to be said about that. I'll just go on here for a little bit. Do you know that his own personal conversion was unfolding while Poland was becoming engulfed in a catastrophic crisis, right? Nazism was coming from one direction and communism was coming from the other direction. And Nazism in particular was perpetrated in large measure by baptized Christians, right? And other baptized Christians like Maximilian Kolbe and Edith Stein were heroes in the midst of that crisis. They were victims of that same crisis. So Wojtyła wondered what could account for the fact that some men and women acted like beasts while others had shown remarkable heroism. For Wojtyła, the national tragedy was unfolding as the backdrop to a personal history in which he lived through the death of every member of his immediate family by the time he was 20 years old. Now, during that season of great and very intense personal suffering, he had the fortuitous encounter with Jan Tyranowski, who was a tailor, a layman who took over the youth ministry at his church. And in the course of their conversations, Jan Tyranowski introduced him to St. John of the Cross, and he was kind of led through the writings of St. John of the Cross and all the insight that St. John of the Cross gives us into mystical experience, dark night of the soul, and all those kind of things, and a real theology of suffering. And all of those things really resonated with him in a very deep way. And he became fascinated with the testimony of St. John's mystical experience. Now, around that time, he also went through discovery that he had a vocation to the priesthood. He had been thinking about becoming an actor. That was kind of his central preoccupation at the time. But he enrolled in the underground seminary, and they handed him a metaphysics book and said, "Here, read this, and we'll give you a test on it." So at that time, he was also working full-time in a chemical plant. So the workers at the chemical plant would kind of send him off into the break room to do a bit of study, and he'd try to get the metaphysics manual mastered while he was, on breaks from his job. And he describes the experience as trying to cut through a jungle, without knowing what the terrain is that he's trying to walk on, because his own preparation in the humanities had not really prepared him for understanding metaphysics. And so he says he cried over this manual. It made him cry. He just couldn't figure out what. And then about 3 months into this whole process, the lights came on. Something clicked for him. He said, "I came into a clearing, and everything that I had already understood intuitively before began to make sense." That whole metaphysical concept of the world gelled for him. So those were a couple of key intellectual epiphanies along the way. So then he goes off to Rome to prepare for his doctorate, and he was again under the direction of a Dominican, Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. And he chose for his topic for his dissertation a study of the virtue of faith according to St. John of the Cross. And more specifically, he wanted to study the virtue of faith in terms of experience. That's what he says in his dissertation. And the point of it was that he wanted to reconcile it with certain aspects of Thomas's thought with which St. John of the Cross seemed to be at odds. Now, believe me, if you've ever tried to read this dissertation, it's a tough read. I'm not sure he helped us a whole lot with that dissertation. I love the guy, but that particular dissertation is really a tough read. And there's a tension there between the scholastic framework upon which John was trying to elaborate this mystical experience, and it never does seem to get worked out. It doesn't get worked out in this dissertation, and it's just a tough read. And it's valuable, I think, to pause and just think about, the problem of trying to study experience at that time. There are issues with the whole issue of experience, and what does that mean? I'm just going to go through a brief survey of the history of philosophy just to set this up. The philosophy of St. Thomas had primarily envisaged man from a cosmological point of view, so it envisaged man as an object among objects in the cosmos, a kind of an objective point of view. And it didn't really dwell on the whole area of experience or consciousness, at least according to Wojtyła. Now, you might have an argument with Wojtyła. I don't know. I can see your wheels turning back there. The modern philosophical project is often characterized as having taken a subjective turn with Descartes. And René Descartes was was looking for a ground for truth. He was looking for a ground for certainty, and he applied he applied methodic doubt to everything he could think of to see if he could come to something that he couldn't actually doubt. And where he got to was, okay, well, if I'm sitting here thinking about this, I must actually exist. I couldn't be thinking about this if I didn't exist. So cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So therefore I exist. And what this did is that modern philosophy turned to consciousness as a ground of existence, which effectively turns the scholastic approach on its head. Scholastic approach took existence as the ground point, and consciousness was an accidental quality of some things that exist. You follow me? But with the cogito, that got turned upside down, and all of a sudden, consciousness is the ground of existence. And that inversion and the subsequent philosophical explorations of human subjectivity and consciousness, which were fruitful in some regards, resulted in a general skepticism, if not outright rejection of metaphysics. And the rejection of metaphysics and the advent then of materialism, determinism, empiricism, and other kinds of isms meant that the existence of objective truth became dubious in the modern mind. And as a result of that philosophical skepticism, the human person gradually became the victim of the lack of an objective moral frame of reference. And that's the roots of genocide. I mean, that's the roots of, that's the roots of the modern tragedy, really. So after the event of Descartes' cogito, metaphysics began to lose its currency in the philosophical circles. Let me just see here. Basically, after Descartes' cogito, the intellectual consequence of it was that there was no credible way to prove that anything real existed outside the mind. You couldn't be sure that this wasn't just some kind of a projection, whatever you're experiencing here. I'm just some kind of a projection on the backside of your mind. So good and evil, and even reality itself, suddenly appeared to be constructs of consciousness rather than objectively real existent things. Neither the existence of God nor objective good and evil could be presumed real. So the path of modern philosophy set itself on a trajectory that would grow ever more distant from the mind of the Church. Experience was in some ways a contentious issue for the magisterium in the late 19th and 20th century, at least where it pertained to matters of faith. The modernist crisis came to a head with the papacy of Pope Pius IX and the publication of his Syllabus of Errors in 1864, which condemned 80 errors, including rationalism, socialism, naturalism, and so forth. In 1907, we have a sequel. Pope Pius X condemned the doctrine of the modernists in Pacende Dominici Gregis. And among other things, it denounced the way in which modern philosophers and modern believers explained spiritual experience. If you want to have a look at section 14 of the doctrine of the modernists here, the problem of the relationship between spiritual experience and its relationship to divine revelation is a big problem at that point. And hindsight suggests that these concerns that were expressed by the Pope weren't altogether groundless, but there was kind of a throwing out the baby with the bathwater in a sense, okay? So here comes Karl Wojtyła just about 30 years after, just a little over 30 years after that was published, and he's in the midst he wants to study faith as experience in his doctoral dissertation. And as you will read when you read his dissertation, it wasn't an easy conversation to have, or an easy study to do. So the second stage of Wojtyła's intellectual journey began a few years later. He went back to Poland after he was ordained. He was assigned a very happy post as a parish pastor. He expected to just be a parish pastor for the rest of his life. That lasted about 9 months before he was assigned to a campus ministry post at the university. And then he was asked to go back, I shouldn't say he was asked, he was told to go back to school and get a second doctorate, habilitation thesis on Max Scheler. And the goal of doing this thesis on Max Scheler would have been a philosopher in the school of phenomenology. The goal was to try to discover a scientific basis for the study of ethics that would be reconcilable with a Catholic approach. So he studied the ethical system of phenomenologist Max Scheler and concluded in the end that Scheler's approach was not suitable. But there was a big discovery in the process, which is that Scheler's approach to the description of experience could be used as to use a Latin term, ancilla theologiae, okay, handmaid to theology. This is we've always talked about philosophy being handmade to theology, but he particularly said, you know what, phenomenology has something to offer us here. Phenomenology would be the study of experience. Let's see here. The phenomenology, or the philosophy of, in this case, in the philosophy of religion, he says, employs a different method from that employed by the philosophy of being, or metaphysics. It's based on the analysis of religious experience and thus takes into account human subjectivity. This kind of analysis is particularly close to my way of thinking. So in the course of his theological and philosophical formation, Wojtyła recognized a weakness in traditional scholastic metaphysics. Its cosmic orientation was not sufficiently preoccupied with the subjective aspect of human experience. While on the other hand, philosophies of consciousness, which had kind of gone off on their own without the help of the church, had gotten locked up inside the mind and weren't able to establish certainty with the world outside the mind. So to Wojtyła, an adequate anthropology required overcoming the philosophical chasm between the philosophy of being and the philosophy of consciousness. An adequate anthropology required both grounding the existence of the conscious human person in the order of the real, as well as attending to the inner conscious life and experience of the human person. So you can see from this overview that he was always taking an interest in the issue of experience, both in a spiritual sense and in a philosophical sense. He was looking for a legitimate way to speak of experience, which he found lacking in the philosophy of St. Thomas. He found such a language in the Phenomenology of Max Scheler, but Scheler's system also had its weaknesses. So he wrote a book, and the book was actually inspired while he was at the Second Vatican Council. He saw something happen at the Second Vatican Council, which I think still has to be brought out, which is a view of the human person and an appreciation of the experience of the human person, and a crystallization of Christian anthropology. He said that, in Gaudium et Spes, there's that beautiful line which we summarize in Theology of the Body, the law of the gift. Is it Gaudium et Spes 42 or 24? I don't remember which number it is. But he says, the human person cannot truly find himself except by a sincere gift of himself. Wojtyła would say that is, in a nutshell, that's Christian anthropology. You cannot find yourself except by a sincere gift of yourself. Anyway, he got to thinking while he was sitting there during these long sessions of the council about this adequate anthropology that he wanted to write. He started sketching notes out while he was sitting there in the council, the aula or whatever it's called, and he went home, took the notes back home to Poland, and he wrote The Acting Person while he was sitting in the chapel for the most part. Now, The Acting Person also is not an easy read. In fact, there's an inside, anybody here from Poland? There's kind of an inside joke in Poland that errant priests could have this for their purgatory. So it underwent an excruciating peer review at the University of Lublin in the early 1970s, 1972, I think. And there was just an awful lot of back and forth. And in the process of that, he was like, right, okay, so a revision of this is probably in order. And a woman, Anna, I can't say her last name. There's an American Polish woman philosopher whose name I can't think of right now. It's rather difficult to pronounce. But anyway, she read it and she thought that it would make a good contribution. So she asked him about publishing it in English. And so it went through a big revision, then it was translated into English, and about halfway through the process of translating it into English, he got made Pope, and he wasn't able to kind of oversee the editing of the whole thing. And there's been an accusation going around the place that she edited a little heavily. Anyway, that is going to be an argument from now till, it's going to be a conspiracy theory from now till the end of time, kind of like Elvis, it's going to be it's not going to get solved because he never had a chance to go back into it again. So anyway, so he wrote this book, The Acting Person, and he highlighted in it, let's see. Seem to have, okay. He also wrote, right around that same time, he wrote another book to try to help prepare Poland for the implementation of the Council, and it was entitled Sources of Renewal. It constitutes a kind of study guide to the Council documents, and simultaneously it's a pastoral application of the philosophical anthropology contained in the acting person. So in this book, he highlights what he identified as the proper hermeneutic for the authentic interpretation of the Second Vatican Council, a concept that he called the enrichment of faith. Wojtyła felt that the Council had brought a certain dimension of faith into greater prominence, and that was the act of self-abandonment to God. Faith as an act of self-abandonment to God. And he goes on to thematize a series of attitudes that should flow from that act of self-abandonment. He doesn't really use the word conversion in that book, but the phenomenological profile of the enrichment of faith that emerges there fits the profile of conversion that emerges in his pontificate. Now, what he did was he tried to press past this traditional definition of faith as intellectual assent, okay, which is to accept as true all that God reveals and the Church teaches. So he focused on a definition of faith that was newly amplified by the Council in Dei Verbum 5, which is faith as an attitude in which man freely commits his entire self to God. Now, this enhanced definition doesn't neglect the other one, okay? It doesn't dismiss the other one, but it fulfills the true meaning of that other one. So it isn't just an intellectual thing, in other words. It involves the whole person. It involves a whole decision process, a whole free self-gift process. The Council, he said, calls for the truth of divine revelation to be situated in human consciousness and calls for a definition of the many attitudes that go to making the individual a believing member of the Church. The Council, he said, amplified the subjective aspect of faith as an encounter between the human person and God who reveals himself. That encounter is a privileged juncture for the profession of faith as an act of total self-abandonment to God. And that's really the key to Karl Wojtyła's interpretation of the Second Vatican Council, and it's a significant hermeneutical key to his whole papacy. So when he became Pope, he set about amplifying that subjective aspect of the experience of conversion for the whole Church. And he applied the philosophical anthropology that he had developed already in the acting person, but he kind of revamped it into a Trinitarian anthropology. So there's 3 encyclicals that he wrote. One on the Son, his very first one actually, Redemptor Hominis. The second one on the Father, Divus in Misericordiae, and then the third one, Dominum et Vivificantem, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And the whole process of conversion is actually embedded in those 3 documents, and it's just a really interesting kind of interplay between the whole Trinitarian Godhead. Now, on the basis of this anthropology or Christian personalism, Pope John Paul gave the Church a language for speaking of the experience of the personal encounter and dialogue with God that draws one into a personal relationship with Him in freedom and truth. Pope John Paul engages in a phenomenological meditation, a kind of contemplative noticing of the inner drama of attitudes and actions of biblical characters that captures the lived experience of their encounter with God. So if you go through the encyclical, he very often chooses someone, and he like the prodigal son, for example. Okay, he'll pick the prodigal son, and then he'll explore the inner attitudes. What's going on with the prodigal son? What's going on with the father? You know, and he looks at the experiential side of the prodigal son going away from the father and coming back to the father. It's a really interesting kind of little method, and Benedict has picked that up. He picked it up in his first encyclical, and he explored the inner experience of a woman who had been taken a slave from Africa, and he explored the process by which she had a conversion as well, even in the midst of kind of captivity and whatnot. So by drawing on what he said about conversion throughout his papacy, a description of the lived experience of conversion in light of this Trinitarian anthropology can be extracted. When a person engages at the personal level with God's self-revelation, it becomes the occasion of a personal encounter with God, which can be quite ordinary or quite dramatic, but God's self-disclosure calls for a reply on the part of the person. And at the heart of this description of conversion is the act of faith, or what John Paul calls self-entrustment or self-gift to God. And far from being anti-ecclesial, such a relationship enlivens the Christian community, is made tangible in, and is sustained by the sacramental life of the Church, and energizes the person for the moral challenges that he or she will face. So that's the central insight of John Paul that I wanted to bring into view in this dissertation. Now, I don't have a lot of time. I was going to talk a little bit about phenomenology. I'm just going to mention a book to you here. Have you ever heard of Dr. Robert Sokolowski or Father Robert Sokolowski? He teaches at CUA. He's probably one of the leading phenomenologists in the world, I'd say. Anyway, this book is a little summary of notions and ideas that are kind of in the whole area of phenomenology. And I used a bit of his work to kind of set up my exploration of this. I won't go into all the details here, but well, maybe I'll have to go into a few. He kind of breaks down three concepts. One is when you're studying an experience, or you're studying anything really, you can conceive of it in terms of parts and wholes. Okay, there are parts and wholes. You can conceive of something called an identity. And then you can conceive of some of these things called presences and absences. So I brought along a little box here, and I'm just going to use this as an example. It's an example he uses. When I'm looking at this box, I can see it from a certain perspective, right? I can't see the whole box, but I know it's there. So what I'm perceiving here are parts of a whole, right? And I'm also perceiving there's some of this that's present to my perception, and some of it that's absent to my perception, okay? And I can perceive here an oblong box, right? Now, it's not the only oblong box in the world. There are other oblong boxes in the world. But this is one example of an oblong box. So it has an identity as an oblong box. And those other oblong boxes out there also share in that identity. Just to go into some other examples, a historical event can be experienced immediately. Like, let's say, Cardinal Newman's beatification. Or was he canonized? Or what happened? Beatification? Okay. Sorry, I wasn't there. Some of you probably experienced that immediately. And some of you can probably experience it now in memory. I experienced it through reading about it. But it was the same historical event. It shares the identity of the event remains the same. Same thing with like the identity of a play, Romeo and Juliet. Same play, produced in Chicago, New York, Paris, London. Same play. You follow? Different actors, different scenario, but same play. So I don't want to go into too much detail with all this. I think I'm going to end up confusing you, and it wouldn't serve the purpose. I want to go into sometimes we find, okay, so when it comes to the phenomenology of Christian conversion, which is the central point of this whole thing, I tried to study the whole breadth of John Paul's writing, and I came up with what I think are 9 parts of a fulfilled conversion. Okay, a conversion in its totality exists in about 9 parts. Now, it might be able to be expressed in different ways by different people. Newman has his Grammar of Assent. Augustine has his Confessions, and we can see different parts of these in it. Anyway, he talks about Sokolowski talks about how sometimes the parts are missing, so it's not complete, right? And when we're talking about conversion, I think that it's a good way to look at the problem of the conversion of the baptized in terms of presences and absences. That when it's complete, when a conversion is fulfilled, all 9 of these parts should be there. In most cases, they aren't. And so when we are trying to address the problem of the conversion of the baptized, we need to think about bringing into intentional view or intentional reality those absences, those things that should be present but that don't seem to be manifesting themselves. Do you follow what I'm saying? So my claim, I guess, the central claim that I'm trying to set forth in this description of John Paul's phenomenology of Christian conversion is that this constitutes a complete picture, or more or less complete picture of what conversion ought to look like. So this whole is the identity of what Christian conversion should manifest itself like in each person who has a conversion, whether it be Mother Teresa, St. Augustine, Karl Wojtyla, Carol Brown, or Kevin O'Reilly, or John Harris, or whoever, okay? So as he laid it out, he talks about, first of all, beginning with this personal dialogue with divine revelation. So in other words, the Lord has initiated a conversation with the human person through divine revelation. Okay, starting with Abraham, but passed on to us through the gift of the Scriptures and the gift of the church and so forth. So that's a gift. And as that person engages in dialogue with the divine revelation, it becomes the occasion of a conscious personal encounter with Jesus Christ. And a decision has to be made at some point, okay? And that's what he calls the threshold of faith in Catechesi Tradendae. Those are his words. He says a lot of times people will remain on the threshold of faith. He's talking about baptized people. Remain on the threshold of faith, okay, without quite crossing over it, okay? So what that constitutes is a personal decision to follow Christ, the act of faith, the gift of self-entrustment, the self-gift to God, whatever you want to call it. Out of that decision, then, a personal relationship or a communion or intimacy with Christ develops, as long as the person kind of continues to conform himself or deepen the habits of faith. And the person who has accepted Jesus Christ by faith endeavors to know better this Jesus to whom he has entrusted himself. That's the words of John Paul II. There's a switch that happens, and all of a sudden it's not me impressing information on you. All of a sudden you're going after the information, okay? It changes something, okay? It changes from passive acceptance to pursuit, you see? As the person is endeavoring to know better this Jesus to whom he has entrusted himself, the next question is, okay, well then, Lord, how do you want me to live? Okay? And that's when this personal obedience of faith emerges, and the moral life no longer becomes a burden, but a challenge. Definitely a challenge, okay? Not a burden, but a challenge. Now, again, I just want to put it on pause and say this is not linear, okay? This is not meant to be one stage after the other. This is kind of an ideal order, but this is not how it happens in most people's lives, okay? So the next stage there, when it talks about personal participation in God's life, and I put underneath it sacramental life, most of us begin there, right? From the moment we're baptized, we are initiated into the sacramental life of the church, and divine life is given to us in baptism. And we're inserted into the Christian community. Okay, and please God, we participate in the Christian community. Now, most of us live our whole lives there in 7 and 8, but we don't dwell too much on these other things. You know, we kind of hope maybe people will pick it up. In Ireland, the attitude is a little bit more, now don't go crazy, isn't it? Okay, and to claim that you're engaging in any of this stuff is seen as well over the top, right? We also may dwell somewhat on the whole issue of vocation. I think sometimes we jump up and down here about vocation, and we haven't worried a bit about whether any of this is going on, okay? But anyway, those 9 things, when they come together, should constitute what we would think of as a fulfilled conversion. And, you know, most of us are on our way there somewhere, you know. But I think the frustration of my heart that kind of drove this whole project is the fact that we sit on 7 and 8, and we are not very intentional about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. We might even get intentional about that moral business, okay? But you see, people don't have the energy for the moral life if they are not hooked up to the love. Okay? If they're not engaged in a personal relationship with the Lord who will help them, who will guide them, who will console them, they're not going to have the energy for it. And that's what I mean kind of by we need to think more and dwell more on the issue of experience and what should be happening in the big picture of the Christian life. When these parts exist separately from the whole, they cease to be identified with the whole of Christian conversion and become instead another identity, which I refer to as any one of a variety of isms. For example, John Paul noted that sacramental life is impoverished and very soon turns into hollow ritualism if it is not based on serious knowledge in the meaning of the sacraments, and catechesis becomes intellectualized if it fails to come alive in sacramental practice. So if sacramental life on its own becomes ritualism and knowledge of doctrine on its own becomes intellectualism, we can extrapolate from this a variety of other isms. Christian morality, when disengaged from the whole of Christian conversion, could be called moralism or rigorism. A personal relationship with God that doesn't participate in or contribute to the Christian community could be called individualism. Solidarity with the human family and works of peace and justice becomes activism or altruism when disengaged from its identity with the whole of Christian conversion. The presence of some dimensions of conversion and the absence of others can indicate an intermediate fulfillment of the reality of Christian conversion that is not yet fulfilled. So, let's see. So I think I've fairly well hit the main points that I wanted to cover in this talk. I didn't dwell as long as I wanted to on Robert Sokolowski, but you can go study him for yourself. It's probably not going to help for me to give you him in a nutshell. My hope is that we can develop pastoral care initiatives that bear these movements in mind and even find some creative strategies for assuring that each baptized person is able to experience a fulfilled conversion. Now, interestingly, in this season in the life of the Church, it seems to be that Benedict has taken the lead of John Paul on all this, and we will be having a 2012 synod on the new evangelization for the transmission of the Christian faith. And guess what? The personal relationship with Christ is right at the heart of it. So if you get a chance, you should go visit the Vatican Radio website. They have a little audio piece on there about the synod that's coming up. The Lineamenta has recently been published. By the way, I've got the Lineamenta here. May I just share a little portion of the Lineamenta with you? Let's see here. The gospel is a living and efficacious word which accomplishes what it says. It's not so much a system of articles of faith and moral precepts, much less a political program, but a person. Jesus Christ, the definitive Word of God who became man. The gospel is the gospel of Jesus Christ. However, not only does the gospel have Jesus Christ as its content, but even more, through the Holy Spirit, Jesus Christ is also the promoter and the center of its proclamation and transmission. Consequently, the goal of the transmission of the faith is the realization of a personal encounter with Jesus Christ in the Spirit, thereby leading to an experiencing of His Father, and our Father. Transmitting the faith means to create in every place and time the conditions for this personal encounter of individuals with Jesus Christ. The faith encounter with the person of Jesus Christ is a relationship with Him, remembering Him in the Eucharist, and through the grace of the Spirit having in us the mind of Jesus Christ. Pope Benedict XVI has stated, being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. Since God has first loved us, love is now no longer a mere command. It is the response to the gift of love with which God draws near to us. The Church realizes herself precisely from carrying out her task of proclaiming the gospel and transmitting the Christian faith. I'll leave it at that with you. I would really encourage you to have a listen to the Vatican Radio piece. It's absolutely beautiful. And the person who's speaking there is incredibly articulate on all these things. So anyway, that's what I have to say. So thanks very much.